Stanley Strangelove by Pauline Kael. A review of A Clockwork Orange from The New Yorker magazine, January 1972. Literal-minded in its sex and brutality, Teutonic in its humor, Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange might be the work of a strict and exacting German professor who set out to make a porno-violent sci-fi comedy. Is there anything sadder and ultimately more repellent than a clean-minded pornographer? The numerous rapes and beatings have no ferocity and no sensuality. They're frigidly, pedantically calculated, and because there is no motivating emotion, the viewer may experience them as an indignity and wish to leave. The movie follows the Anthony Burgess novel so closely that the book might have served as the script. Yet that thick-skulled German professor may be Dr. Strangelove himself, because the meanings are turned around. Burgess's 1962 novel is set in a vaguely socialist future, roughly the late 70s or early 80s. A dreary, routinized England that roving gangs of teenage thugs terrorize at night. In perceiving the amoral destructive potential of youth gangs, Burgess's ironic fable differs from Orwell's 1984 in a way that already seems prophetically accurate. The novel is narrated by the leader of one of these gangs, Alex, a conscienceless schoolboy sadist, and in a witty, extraordinarily sustained literary conceit, narrated in his own slang, Nadsat, the teenager's special dialect. The book is a fast read. Burgess, a composer-turned-novelist, has an ebullient musical sense of language, and you pick up the meanings of the strange words as the prose rhythms speed you along. Alex enjoys stealing, stomping, raping, and destroying until he kills a woman and is sent to prison for 14 years. After serving 2, he arranges to get out by submitting to an experiment in conditioning, and he is turned into a moral robot who becomes nauseated at thoughts of sex and violence. Released when he is harmless, he falls prey to his former victims, who beat him and torment him until he attempts suicide. This leads to criticism of the government that robotized him, turned him into a Clockwork Orange, and he is deconditioned, becoming once again a thug, and now at loose and triumphant. The ironies are protean, but Burgess is clearly a humanist. His point of view is that of a Christian horrified by the possibilities of a society turned Clockwork Orange, in which life is so mechanized that men lose their capacity for moral choice. There seems to be no way in this boring, dehumanizing society for the boys to release their energies, except in vandalism and crime. They do what they do as a matter of course. Alex the sadist is as mechanized a creature as Alex the good. Stanley Kubrick's Alex, played by Malcolm McDowell, is not so much an expression of how this society has lost its soul as he is a force pitted against the society, and by making the victims of the thugs more repulsive and contemptible than the thugs, Kubrick has learned to love the punk sadist. The end is no longer the ironic triumph of a mechanized punk, but a real triumph. Alex is the only likable person we see. His cynical bravado suggests a broad-nosed working-class Olivier, more alive than anybody else in the movie, and younger and more attractive, and McDowell plays him exuberantly, with the power and slyness of a young Cagney. Despite what Alex does at the beginning, McDowell makes you root for his foxiness and for his crookedness. For most of the movie, we see him tortured and beaten and humiliated, so when his bold, aggressive punk's nature is restored to him, it seems not a joke on all of us, but rather a victory in which we share, and Kubrick takes an exultant tone. The look in Alex's eyes at the end tells us that he isn't just a mechanized, choiceless sadist, but prefers sadism and knows he can get by with it. Far from being a little parable about the dangers of soullessness and the horrors of force, whether employed by individuals against each other or by society in conditioning. The movie becomes a vindication of Alex, saying that the punk was a free human being and only the good Alex was a robot. The trick of making the attacked less human than their attackers, so you feel no sympathy for them, is, I think, symptomatic of a new attitude in movies. This attitude says there's no moral difference. Stanley Kubrick has assumed the deformed, self-righteous perspective of a vicious young punk who says, "Everything's rotten, why shouldn't I do what I want? They're worse than I am." In the new mood, perhaps movies in their cumulative effect are partly responsible for it. People want to believe the hyperbolic worst, want to believe in the degradation of the victims, that they are dupes and phonies and weaklings. I can't accept that Kubrick is merely reflecting this post-assassinations, post-Manson mood. I think he's catering to it. I think he wants to dig it. This picture plays with violence in an intellectually seductive way, and though it has no depth, it's done in such a slow, heavy style that those prepared to like it can treat its puzzling aspects as oracular. It can easily be construed as an ambiguous mystery play, a visionary warning against the establishment. There are a million ways to justify identifying with Alex. Alex is fighting repression. He's alone against the system. What he does isn't nearly as bad as what the government does, both in the movie and in the United States now. Why shouldn't he be violent? That's all the establishment has ever taught him and us to be. The point of the book was that we must be as men, that we must be able to take responsibility for what we are. The point of the movie is much more au courant. Kubrick has removed many of the obstacles to our identifying with Alex. The Alex of the book has had his personal habits cleaned up a bit. His fondness for squishing small animals under his tires, his taste for 10-year-old girls, his beating up of other prisoners, and so on. And Kubrick aids the identification with Alex by small, directional choices throughout. The writer whom Alex cripples, played by Patrick McGee, and the woman he kills are cartoon nasties with upper-class accents a mile wide. McGee has been encouraged to act like a pathetic madman. He seems to be preparing for a career in horror movies. Burgess gave us society through Alex's eyes, and so the vision was deformed. And Kubrick, carrying over from Dr. Strangelove his jokey adolescent view of hypocritical, sexually dirty authority figures, and extending it to all adults, has added an extra layer of deformity. The straight people are far more twisted than Alex. They seem inhuman and incapable of suffering. He alone suffers, and how he suffers. He's a male Little Nell, screaming in a straitjacket during the brainwashing, sweet and helpless when rejected by his parents, alone weeping on a bridge, beaten, bleeding, lost in a rainstorm, pounding his head on the floor and crying for death. Kubrick pours on the hearts and flowers. What is done to Alex is far worse than what Alex has done, so society itself can be felt to justify Alex's hoodlumism. The movie's confusing and finally corrupt morality is not, however, what makes it such an abhorrent viewing experience. It is offensive long before one perceives where it is heading, because it has no shadings. Kubrick, a director with an Arctic spirit, is determined to be pornographic, and he has no talent for it. Los Olvidados. Buñuel showed teenagers committing horrible brutalities, and even though you had no illusions about their victims, one in particular was a foul old lecher, you were appalled. Buñuel makes you understand the pornography of brutality, The pornography is in what human beings are capable of doing to other human beings. Kubrick has always been one of the least sensual and least erotic of directors, and his attempts here at phallic humor are like a professor's lead balloons. He tries to work up kicky, violent scenes, carefully estranging you from the victim so that you can enjoy the rapes and beatings. But I think one is more likely to feel cold antipathy toward the movie than horror at the violence, or enjoyment of it either. Kubrick's martinet control is obvious in the terrible performances he gets from everybody but McDowell, and in the inexorable pacing. The film has a distinctive style of estrangement, gloating close-ups, bright, hard-edged, third-degree lighting, and abnormally loud voices. It's a style, all right. The movie doesn't look like other movies, or sound like them, but it's a leering, portentous style. After the balletic brawling of the teenage gangs, with bodies flying as in a Western saloon fight, and after the gang-bang of the writer's wife and an orgy in speeded-up motion, you're primed for more action, but you're left stranded in the prison sections, trying to find some humor in tired schoolboy jokes about a Hitlerian guard. The movie retains a little of the slangy nadsat, but none of the fast rhythms of Burgess's prose, and so the dialect seems much more arch than it does in the book. Many of the dialogue sequences go on and on into a stupor of inactivity. Kubrick seems infatuated with the hypnotic possibilities of static setups. At times you feel as if you were trapped in front of the frames of a comic strip for a numbing 10 minutes per frame. When Alex's correctional officer visits his home, and he and Alex sit on a bed, the camera sits on the two of them. Long after we've got the point, the composition is still telling us to appreciate its cleverness. The ponderous technique is hardly leavened by the structural use of classical music to characterize sequences. Each sequence is scored to Purcell, synthesized on a Moog, Rossini or Beethoven, while Elgar and others are used for brief satiric effects. In the book, the doctor who has devised the conditioning treatment explains why the horror images used in it are set to music. It's a useful emotional heightener. But the whole damned movie is heightened this way. Yes, the music is effective, but the effect is self-important. When I pass a newsstand and see the saintly, bearded intellectual Kubrick on the cover of Saturday Review, I wonder, do people notice things, like the way Kubrick cuts to the rival teenage gang before Alex and his hoods arrive to fight them, just so we can have the pleasure of watching that gang strip the struggling girl they mean to rape? Alex's voice is on the track announcing his arrival, but Kubrick can't wait for Alex to arrive, because then he couldn't show us as much. That girl is stripped for our benefit. It's the purest exploitation. Yet this film lusts for greatness, and I'm not sure that Kubrick knows how to make simple movies anymore, or that he cares to. I don't know how consciously he has thrown this film to youth. Maybe he's more of a showman than he lets on. A lucky showman with opportunism built into the cells of his body. The film can work at a pop fantasy level for a young audience already prepared to accept Alex's view of the society, ready to believe that that's how it is. At the movies, we are gradually being conditioned to accept violence as a sensual pleasure. The directors used to say they were showing us its real face, and how ugly it was, in order to sensitize us to its horrors. You don't have to be very keen to see that they are now, in fact, desensitizing us. They are saying that everyone is brutal, and the heroes must be as brutal as the villains, or they turn into fools. There seems to be an assumption that if you are offended by movie brutality, you are somehow playing into the hands of the people who want censorship. But this would deny those of us who don't believe in censorship the use of the only counterbalance, the freedom of the press to say that there's anything conceivably damaging in these films, the freedom to analyze their implications. If we don't use this critical freedom, we are implicitly saying that no brutality is too much for us, that only squares and people who believe in censorship are concerned with brutality. Actually, those who believe in censorship are primarily concerned with sex, and they generally worry about violence only when it's eroticized. This means that practically no one raises the issue of the possible cumulative effects of movie brutality. Yet surely, when night after night atrocities are served up to us as entertainment, it's worth some anxiety. We become clockwork oranges if we accept all this pop culture without asking what's in it. How can people go on talking about the dazzling brilliance of movies and not notice that the directors are sucking up to the thugs in the audience? Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, share, comment, all that stuff.